On my 70th birthday, my daughter said, "This is your last one here." She had no idea what I owned. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 70 years old. I spent 35 years as a title examiner, which means for 35 years my entire job was finding the lie hidden inside a stack of paper that looked perfectly clean. So when my daughter stood up at my own birthday table, raised her glass, and said, "This is your last one here, Mom," smiling like she'd delivered good news, I already knew three things she didn't. I knew the deed she thought she owned was defective. I knew the notary who signed it had a suspended commission on the day he stamped it. And I knew that 4 months earlier, using a company with my late husband's initials in the name, I had quietly bought the mortgage note on the house she actually lived in. She thought she was taking my home away from me. She had no idea I already owned a piece of hers. Welcome back to Gia Mom Stories, where mothers share the moments that tested everything they built, and the quiet precision that carried them through. If this one hits close to home, subscribe and drop a comment before we start, because you're going to want to remember where you were when this story got good. Let me tell you who I really am, because the woman my daughter saw across that birthday table was not the whole picture. Nobody's mother ever is. Eleanor Whitfield, title examiner, 35 years, first at Granger County Abstract and Title, then the last 19 of those years as a partner at Whitfield Doyle Title and Escrow on Chestnut Street in Millhaven, New Hampshire, population 9,000, one hardware store, one diner, and a county registry of deeds I could navigate blindfolded. My job, in plain language, was to make sure that when somebody bought a piece of land, they actually got what they paid for. Every parcel has a paper trail going back decades, sometimes a century: deeds, mortgages, liens, easements, judgments, tax sales, divorces that split a property in half and never got recorded right. My job was to read all of it, catch the gap, catch the fraud, catch the forgotten lien from 1962 that would otherwise surface at the worst possible moment and blow up somebody's closing. In 35 years, I cleared over 6,000 titles. I killed 11 closings outright because something in the chain didn't sit right with me, and every single time, I was right. People used to joke that I could smell a bad signature the way a baker smells burnt bread. That wasn't a compliment exactly, but I took it as one. I want you to hold on to that fact, because it matters more than anything else I'm going to tell you tonight. Everything that happened to my family happened because one person in this story reads paper for a living and does not stop reading until the paper makes sense. That person was me. My daughter forgot that. Or maybe she never really understood it in the first place, because to her I was never a professional. I was just Mom, the one who packed lunches and drove carpool and, later, the one who was supposedly getting a little slower, a little more forgetful, a little easier to move around like furniture. I want to give you one example, because it explains more about me than any resume could. In 1997, I was examining a title for a young couple buying their first home on Poplar Street, a modest 2-bedroom, nothing extraordinary. Everything looked clean until I noticed a name in a 1974 mortgage satisfaction that didn't quite match the name on the original mortgage by one letter: Donovan versus Donovan. Most examiners would have called it a clerical error and moved on. I didn't. I pulled the underlying probate file and discovered the satisfaction had actually been recorded against the wrong parcel entirely, meaning the real mortgage on that Poplar Street property had never technically been paid off in the public record, a 23-year-old lien hiding in plain sight. It took me 4 days and 2 trips to a different county to untangle it, and the closing was delayed a week, and the young couple was furious with me right up until I explained that without that 4 days, they'd have bought a house with an unresolved quarter-century-old mortgage attached to it. That's the job. Nobody thanks you for the disaster they never had to live through. You do it anyway, because somewhere down the line, somebody's whole life depends on you being the kind of person who notices a single wrong letter. I grew up outside Concord, the daughter of a mill worker and a seamstress, neither of whom finished high school. I put myself through 2 years of community college studying real estate law because a guidance counselor told me I had, in her words, a suspicious mind, and she meant it as praise. I met Walter Whitfield at 23, at a Grange Hall dance nobody my daughter's generation would understand the appeal of. Walter built things. He was a framing carpenter who became a general contractor who became, by the time he was 50, the man half the town called when they wanted a house that wouldn't need repairs for 40 years. Walter built our house himself in 1985, on 4 acres out on Birch Hollow Road, board by board, on weekends and evenings, while I worked full-time at the title company and carried our daughter on my hip through the framing lumber. He used to say a house was just a very large, very slow promise. You keep it or you don't. Walter kept his. He built it in stages, the way a man builds something when he refuses to take on debt he isn't certain he can carry. The foundation and framing went up the first summer. He didn't close in the second floor until the following spring, once he'd saved enough from a run of good jobs to buy the lumber outright. I remember standing in the unfinished kitchen in 1986 with Vanessa asleep in a bassinet on the plywood subfloor, no cabinets yet, just a card table and 2 folding chairs, and Walter telling me, "Don't worry, Elle, this house isn't going anywhere and neither am I." He always called me Elle when he meant something. It took him 6 years, working weekends and evenings around his paying jobs, to finish it completely. The porch last, in 1991, the same porch where Vanessa would carve her initials 2 years later. Every closet shelf, every windowsill, every stair tread in that house came out of Walter's own hands. He used to run his palm along a newel post he'd turned on a borrowed lathe and tell me that a house built like that doesn't just shelter a family, it remembers one. I think about that a great deal now. Walter built that house to outlast us both, and he never imagined it would one day need to survive our own daughter trying to take it out from under me. We had one child. Vanessa. Born in 1980, the same year Walter poured the foundation on Birch Hollow Road. She grew up in that house, learned to walk on those pine floors Walter sanded by hand, carved her initials into the porch railing when she was 9 and Walter never sanded that spot smooth again, not once, not in 30 years. I want to be honest about something before I go further. I loved my daughter without reservation for 44 years. I still do. This isn't a story about a monster. It's a story about a woman who let fear make her small and mean, and about what happens when you underestimate the person who taught you to read. Vanessa married Derek Cole when she was 26. They met at a lumber supplier's holiday party, of all places, Derek delivering a bid for a job and Vanessa there with a friend who worked the front desk. Derek ran his own construction outfit, Cole Builders, framing and general contracting, the same trade as his father-in-law, which Walter always found a little bit funny and a little bit flattering. Walter liked Derek from the start, the way one tradesman recognizes another, and used to say Derek had good hands and an honest handshake, which from Walter was about the highest praise a son-in-law could earn. Their wedding was small, a backyard ceremony at our house on Birch Hollow Road, folding chairs on Walter's lawn, and I remember thinking, watching Vanessa walk across that grass in her mother's altered dress, that I had done something right. For the first 15 years of that marriage, Derek did fine. Not spectacular, but fine, a few custom homes a year, steady subcontractor relationships, a decent reputation around 3 counties, the kind of business a careful man builds slowly and doesn't overextend. They had 2 children, Mason, now 10, a serious, quiet boy who likes to sit beside me while I do crossword puzzles and guess the answers before I've finished reading the clue, and Lily, 7, all noise and motion, the kind of child who narrates her own life out loud whether or not anyone's listening. For a long stretch of years, Sunday dinners at my table were the best part of my week. Derek would talk shop with Walter before Walter died, then later with me, since I understood the paperwork side of his business better than most people he knew. Vanessa and I would do the dishes together the old-fashioned way, side by side at the sink, the way my own mother and I once did. I want you to know that, too. I'm not telling you this story to erase the good years. I'm telling it because the good years are exactly why nobody saw the bad ones coming, including me. Walter died 4 years ago. A stroke, sudden, on a Tuesday morning while he was measuring a doorframe in the garage for a shed he never got to build. He was 71. I found him. I was 66 years old and I had been married to that man for 43 years, and then I wasn't married to anyone anymore, and the house on Birch Hollow Road, every board of which he had nailed by hand, went very, very quiet. Grief does something to a person's judgment. I know that now the way I know a defective deed by the font on the notary stamp, from hard, expensive experience. In the first year after Walter died, I was not myself. I was a woman who had spent 35 years finding other people's blind spots and I did not see my own. That's the year it started, though I wouldn't understand what it was for almost 3 more years. About 4 months after the funeral, Vanessa and Derek came to Sunday dinner with a folder. Derek did most of the talking, which should have told me something right there, because estate matters were never his lane, they were mine. He said they'd been talking to a guy, an estate planning fellow Derek knew through a supplier, and this fellow said that with Walter gone, I really ought to simplify my affairs. Avoid probate. Add Vanessa to the deed as a joint tenant with right of survivorship, so if anything ever happened to me, the house would just pass to her automatically, no court, no lawyer, no hassle. It's what everybody does now, Mom, Vanessa said. It protects you. I want to stop here and tell you something about myself that I am not proud of. I had cleared 6,000 titles. I had killed closings over missing notary seals and expired power of attorney documents. And 4 months after burying my husband, grieving and exhausted and grateful that my daughter was sitting at my table instead of avoiding me, I signed papers I did not read carefully. Derek had brought a notary with him, a cousin of his named Wendell Pruitt, a heavy-set, cheerful man who did small side work notarizing closing documents for contractors. Wendell set the papers in front of me at my own kitchen table, told me where to sign, and I signed, because my daughter was holding my hand across the table and telling me this would make things easier, and I wanted, more than I wanted to be careful, to believe her. I remember small, useless details from that evening the way you remember details from any moment your life quietly turns a corner without announcing itself. There was a casserole dish soaking in the sink because I hadn't gotten to it. Vanessa had brought a store-bought pie, apple, because she knew I hadn't had the energy to bake in weeks. Wendell made a joke about his allergies acting up and blew his nose twice before he ever opened his folder. Derek kept saying it was really nothing, standard stuff, the kind of thing every family does, and I remember nodding along, my pen in hand, thinking about Walter's side of the bed still made up exactly the way he'd left it that morning, because I hadn't been able to bring myself to disturb it. I signed where Wendell pointed. I did not read the caption at the top of the page that said quitclaim deed in plain block letters, because I was not, in that moment, the woman who had cleared 6,000 titles. I was a 66-year-old widow who wanted her daughter to stay a little longer at the table. Grief makes fools of careful people. I have made my peace with that particular truth, but it took me a long while to get there. That signature sat in a drawer of my own memory for almost 3 years, filed under the year I wasn't quite myself, and I genuinely did not think about it again until the spring before my 70th birthday, when an old habit I'd kept for 35 years saved my life. Here is something they don't teach you outside the profession. A title examiner does not trust paper. Not other people's paper, and not her own. Every single year, on the first Monday in April, I drove to the Granger County Registry of Deeds and pulled my own property record. Not because I suspected anything. Because it was a discipline, the same way a surgeon washes her hands even in an empty room. I had done it every April for 30 years, going back to when Walter and I first built the house. Vanessa didn't know I did this. Derek certainly didn't. It was mine, a small private ritual, 5 minutes at a computer terminal with a cup of coffee from the diner next door. That April, the Monday after Easter, I sat down at the terminal the way I had 100 times before, typed in the parcel number for Birch Hollow Road, and pulled the current vesting deed. And there it was, on the screen, recorded 3 years and 2 months earlier, right where any title examiner in the state would have found it in about 90 seconds. A quitclaim deed, Book 4471, page 209, granting Eleanor Whitfield and Vanessa Cole as joint tenants with right of survivorship. My daughter's name was on the title to my house. Not someday. Now. Recorded, stamped, official, and sitting in the public record for anyone to see for 3 years, while I told myself I'd simply signed a power of attorney for banking, because that was what I remembered being told. I sat in that county building for a long time. I did not cry. I want to be very clear about that, because I know what this genre expects, and I am not going to give you a woman falling apart in a government building. I sat very still, the way I used to sit when I found a fatal flaw 2 days before a closing, and I did what 35 years of training taught me to do. I did not react. I documented. I pulled a certified copy of the deed. I photographed the notary block, Wendell Pruitt's signature, his commission number, his seal. I drove straight from the registry to the Secretary of State's Licensing Division website on my phone in the parking lot and searched that commission number, because something about the seal looked wrong to me. The ink was too dark, too fresh-looking for a stamp Wendell claimed he'd owned for years. What I found made my hands go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the April weather. Wendell Pruitt's notary commission had expired 11 months before he stamped my deed. He had let it lapse, kept using an old stamp anyway, and notarized a signature transferring half interest in my home while legally unauthorized to notarize anything at all. That's not a technicality to a title examiner. That's the whole ballgame. A defective notarization doesn't just embarrass the notary. In the state of New Hampshire, it can void the deed's validity as a recorded instrument, or at minimum give any court ample grounds to set it aside as improperly executed. I had spent 35 years killing closings for exactly this kind of defect. I had just found one sitting on top of my own life like a rock I'd been walking past for 3 years without looking down. I did not go home and confront my daughter that night. Stay with me here, because I know how badly you want me to. But you don't win a title dispute by shouting across a kitchen table. You win it the way you win everything in this business, with a chain of custody so clean nobody can argue with it. The next morning I called Rosalind Chin. Roz and I had worked together for 26 years, first as competitors at rival title companies and then, for the last decade of my career, as close as sisters, the kind of friendship built on 2 women who both understood that a comma in the wrong place in a legal description could cost somebody their home. Roz had retired from private practice 5 years earlier and taken a part-time position as a deputy in the Registry of Deeds itself, which meant she now sat, quite literally, inside the building where the evidence of my own betrayal was filed under my own name. Roz, I need you to look at something, and I need you to tell nobody. Not even your husband. I drove over that afternoon. Roz pulled the recorded instrument up on the county system, the real one, the internal one, not the public terminal, and she went quiet in a way I recognized because it was the exact silence I used when I found something bad. Eleanor, she said finally, this notarization is void on its face. Pruitt's commission lapsed the previous May. This deed should never have been accepted for recording, but the clerk on duty that week was a temp, and temps don't always cross-check commission status against the current registry list the way they should. This is a filing error compounded by a fraud. You have two separate grounds to challenge it. I want to tell you what it felt like to hear a friend of 26 years use the word fraud about my own daughter's husband's family, in a government building, in a whisper, because we were both professionals enough to know some things aren't said above a certain volume even when nobody else is around. It felt like relief and grief arriving in the same breath. Relief, because I finally understood what had actually happened to me. Grief, because understanding it meant I had to accept that my son-in-law had walked into my kitchen 4 months after I buried my husband and handed me a defective legal instrument disguised as a kindness. Roz pulled one more thing that afternoon, almost as an afterthought, the way a good examiner always checks one document further than she strictly needs to. She pulled Wendell Pruitt's notary journal requirements and cross-referenced them against the state's public complaint log. Notaries in New Hampshire are required to keep a journal of every signature they witness, name, date, type of document, a physical description of the identification presented. Roz couldn't access Wendell's private journal from her seat at the registry, but she could see that his commission hadn't merely lapsed by accident, it had lapsed after he failed to complete a mandatory continuing education requirement 2 years running, meaning the state had sent him at least 2 notices he'd either ignored or never opened. That detail mattered to me more than it probably should have. It meant this wasn't a single careless afternoon. It meant Wendell had been operating without authority for the better part of 2 years, notarizing who knew how many other documents for who knew how many other unsuspecting people, and my deed had simply been one more stamp in a stack he never should have been making at all. I want to pause the discovery for a moment, because I need you to understand why this mattered so much, beyond the paper itself. A joint tenancy with right of survivorship isn't just a name on a piece of paper. It means the other person on that deed has a present, legal ownership interest in your home, today, not someday. It means they can, under the right circumstances, force what's called a partition action, essentially ask a court to divide or sell jointly owned property, even over the other owner's objection, if they can show sufficient cause. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of instrument you would want in place if you were planning, eventually, to force a sale of a house you didn't fully own. I didn't know yet that this was the plan. I only knew the deed was defective and that nobody had told me the truth about what I signed. So I did what I had done 11 times across 35 years when a title came across my desk that didn't sit right. I built the file before I said a word to anyone involved. I retained Nathaniel Pierce, an estate attorney 2 towns over who I'd worked opposite for a dozen closings over the years and trusted the way you trust anyone you've watched operate honestly under pressure. Nathaniel read the deed, read Roz's notes, read the Secretary of State printout on Wendell Pruitt's lapsed commission, and told me the same thing Roz had, in more formal language and at considerably higher cost per hour. We can file to correct the record. Given the defective notarization, we have strong grounds to have the joint tenancy set aside and sole title restored to you. This is not close, Mrs. Whitfield. This is about as clean a case as I've seen. I told him to prepare the filing but hold it. I wasn't ready yet. Something in me, the same instinct that used to make me pull one more document before I'd sign off on a closing, told me there was more to this than a badly executed favor for an elderly widow. Fraud like this doesn't usually happen in isolation. People don't casually forge their way onto a house deed unless the house means something specific to their plans. I needed to know what the plan was before I moved to stop it. It took me another 6 weeks to find out, and I found it the way I found everything else, by paying quiet attention to things my family assumed I was too old or too distracted to notice. The first thread was Derek's business. Coal builders had been struggling for close to 2 years, though I hadn't understood the scale of it until I started, deliberately now, actually listening at Sunday dinners instead of simply enjoying them. Derek had overextended himself on a 12-lot development out past the county line called Fairhaven Meadows, breaking ground on spec homes in the spring 3 years earlier, back when lumber was cheap and buyers were plentiful, and Derek, by his own later admission, got a little drunk on how easy the first 6 lots had sold. He financed the equipment and the carrying costs for the remaining lots through Granger Community Bank, using coal builders' commercial property as partial collateral. Then rates climbed twice in 1 year, buyers vanished overnight the way they do, and 4 of those 12 homes sat half-framed and unsold for the better part of 18 months, bleeding carrying costs every single month with nothing coming in to offset them. By the spring before my birthday, Derek had let 2 framers go, was doing labor himself on weekends to save payroll, and had, according to what I pieced together later, missed 3 consecutive equipment financing payments. I heard him on the phone once, out on my own back porch during a Sunday dinner, thinking I was inside doing dishes, telling someone named Grady that the bank had started sending certified letters and that he needed $40,000, maybe $50,000 by fall, or he was going to lose the equipment outright. I heard the words second lien, and I heard the words if we don't move something by fall, and I filed those words away exactly the way I would file a suspicious entry in a chain of title, not yet meaningful on its own, but the kind of thing a careful examiner remembers until it connects to something else. The second thread was smaller and crueler, and it was the one that told me everything. Vanessa began, very gently at first, suggesting to me and to anyone who would listen that I seemed different lately. Tired. A little foggy. She mentioned to my son, her older brother Todd, that I'd repeated a story twice at Easter, which was true, and which was also something every 70-year-old on earth has done at a family dinner without it meaning anything. She started calling twice a week instead of once, always asking gentle, probing questions. Mom, do you remember where you put the checkbook? Mom, are you sure you paid the property tax bill, because I didn't see a confirmation? Mom, have you thought about whether this house is really manageable for you alone anymore? I recognized the pattern before I could name it, because 35 years of reading fraudulent documents teaches you to recognize a narrative being constructed in real time. She wasn't asking because she was worried. She was building a record. The same way I built a case file, my daughter was quietly building a story about my decline, one gentle comment at a time, to anyone who would listen, so that when the moment came to act, there would already be a chorus of family members nodding along, saying, "Well, she has seemed a little different lately, hasn't she?" There was a specific evening, a Tuesday in May, that I keep returning to now with new eyes. Vanessa had come by unannounced to drop off Lily's soccer cleats she'd left at my house the weekend before, and she found me at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on, going through the property tax bill the way I did every quarter. "Mom," she said, "you already paid that. I saw the confirmation come through last month." I told her I hadn't, that this was a new bill, a different one, and I showed her the date on it, clear as day, and she looked at it for a long moment and said, "Oh, you're right, sorry, I must be thinking of something else." It was such a small thing. I nearly forgot it happened. But 3 weeks later, at a family barbecue, I heard her mention to Todd's wife, almost in passing, that she'd been a little worried about me lately, that I'd seemed confused about a tax bill. She had turned her own mistake into evidence of mine, and she hadn't even seemed to notice she'd done it. That is the particular cruelty of this kind of scheme. I don't believe Vanessa sat down and consciously decided to lie about me. I believe she needed the story to be true, and so small, ordinary moments started reshaping themselves in her memory to fit it. I called Todd myself, carefully, without alarming him. Todd is 42, lives 2 states away, an engineer with 3 kids of his own and not nearly as involved in the day-to-day of Millhaven as Vanessa, which had always made him, without either of us intending it, less useful to whatever plan Derek and Vanessa were building, and more useful to me now as an outside observer with no stake in the story being told. "Todd," I said, "has your sister said anything to you lately about my memory, or about the house?" There was a pause I didn't love. "Actually, yeah, Mom. She mentioned maybe looking at some places. Like, senior living places. She said she didn't want to worry you yet, wanted to research it first. She sent me a brochure for somewhere called Sunrise Meadows." I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, the way I sat with it. Sunrise Meadows. My daughter had researched, priced, and toured. I would confirm the tour 3 weeks later through a receipt in her email that Todd, bless him, forwarded to me after I asked directly, an assisted living facility for me, without my knowledge, while simultaneously holding a defective deed that gave her legal standing to argue the house needed to be sold. The picture assembled itself the way a chain of title assembles itself once you have enough documents in front of you. Cole Builders was drowning in debt. Derek needed capital, fast, and a 4-acre property on Birch Hollow Road with no mortgage, built solid by a man who never cut a corner in his life, appraised at roughly $450,000, was sitting there with my daughter's name already, fraudulently, on the deed. All they needed was for me to be gently, plausibly, deemed no longer capable of managing my own affairs, or simply persuaded to downsize for my own good, and the house could be sold, the debt could be paid, and I would end up in a room at Sunrise Meadows with a view of a parking lot, grateful, presumably, that my children had taken such good care of me. I did not confront them. Not yet. I want to explain why. Because I know some of you watching this are gripping your phones right now wanting me to have marched into that kitchen and ended it on the spot. I didn't, because a case built on outrage collapses under one good lawyer's cross-examination, and a case built on documents does not. I had spent 35 years learning that lesson, and I was not going to abandon it now that the client was myself. So I did one more thing. The most important thing, the one that would end up changing everything about how this story ended. I still had contacts from 35 years in the title and mortgage industry, including a former colleague, Marjorie Ostrander, who had left title work 15 years earlier to go into mortgage note investing, buying distressed or non-performing loans from banks that wanted them off their books, sometimes for pennies on the dollar, and either working out payment plans or, when necessary, foreclosing. It is not glamorous work. It is also not, contrary to what television would have you believe, the work of villains. It's simply a market, and Marjorie had made a comfortable, honest living in it for over a decade. I called Marjorie in June and asked her, casually at first, whether Cole Builders carried a note with any regional bank she might have visibility into. It took her 9 days to come back to me. And when she did, what she found nearly stopped my heart. Cole Builders equipment and construction financing was held with Granger Community Bank, and Granger Community, squeezed by their own regulators after a string of bad construction loans across the county, had quietly begun offloading a package of distressed notes to private investors that very quarter, to clean up their balance sheet before an examination. Derek's note, his construction loan, secured in part by a lien against Cole Builders' commercial lot and, critically, cross-collateralized against Derek and Vanessa's own home on Larkspur Court, was in that package. I did not hesitate the way I had hesitated over the deed. I formed a small holding company that week, through Nathaniel Pierce, named Birch Hollow Holdings LLC, after the road Walter built our house on, because I wanted, in some private and stubborn way, for his name to be part of what happened next even though he wasn't alive to see it. I used a portion of my own retirement savings Vanessa and Derek did not know existed because I had never once, in 4 years of Sunday dinners, discussed the details of my own finances with people who had shown me they couldn't be trusted with a deed. Marjorie brokered the purchase quietly, the way these transactions are always done, through an assignment of the note and the underlying security instrument. By the end of July, 3 weeks before my 70th birthday, Birch Hollow Holdings LLC, meaning me, legally held the promissory note and the mortgage securing Derek and Vanessa's own home, worth just under $300,000, along with a portion of the debt against Derek's business lot. They had spent 3 years quietly, fraudulently, working their way onto the title of my house. I had spent 3 months, cleanly and legally, working my way onto the paper underneath theirs. I did not do it out of spite. I want to be honest about my motives, the way I've tried to be honest about everything else in this story. I did it because 35 years in this business taught me one unbreakable rule: never walk into a negotiation without leverage, and never let the other side know the size of the table until you're ready to show them. Which brings us back to the birthday. August the 14th, my 70th birthday, a Saturday, warm, the kind of late summer evening in New Hampshire where the light goes gold around 6 and stays that way for almost 2 hours. I hosted it myself, at the house, at the long pine table Walter built with his own hands the same summer Vanessa was born, because I was not going to celebrate my 70th birthday anywhere else while there was still breath in my body and a defective deed in my county's public record. Todd flew in with his family. Vanessa and Derek came with Mason and Lily. Roz came, because Roz had come to every one of my birthdays for 20 years and I was not about to change that now, and because, though nobody else at that table knew it yet, I needed a witness in the room who already understood exactly what was in that manila folder sitting in my study upstairs. I made a roast, the way I always did, and a yellow cake with lemon frosting, because it was Walter's favorite and I have never once, in 4 birthdays without him, stopped making it. The children ran through the yard. Todd's wife took photographs. For most of that dinner, it looked, to anyone glancing through the kitchen window, exactly like the kind of family evening people spend their whole lives hoping to have. Then Derek stood up with his glass, tapping it with a fork the way people do at weddings, and said he wanted to say a few words for Mom's birthday. I watched Vanessa's face while he talked, because I had spent 35 years learning to watch a person's face while someone else read the terms of an agreement out loud, and I saw the particular kind of pride a person wears when they believe they are about to deliver good news that also happens to solve their own problem. Derek talked about family, about how much the house on Birch Hollow Road meant to all of us, about how Walter would be proud of the family he'd built here. And then he said that he and Vanessa had been doing a lot of thinking, that they loved me and wanted what was best for me, and that they thought it was time to talk seriously about a transition, somewhere smaller, somewhere with support close by, somewhere I wouldn't have to manage 4 acres and a big old house on my own anymore. Vanessa reached over, took my hand across the pine table Walter built, squeezed it, and looked at me with an expression I recognized now for exactly what it was, the same performed warmth I'd once watched clients use across a closing table right before they tried to slip an unrecorded lean past me. And then she said it. Raised her own glass a little, smiling for the whole table, for her children, for her brother, for Roz. "This is your last one here, Mom. Next year we're going to celebrate somewhere new. Somewhere easier." I want you to understand something about that moment, because I've turned it over in my mind more times than I can count in the months since. Everyone at that table who didn't know the truth heard a loving, if presumptuous, statement from a daughter looking out for her aging mother. Todd looked touched. Lily clapped, 7 years old and delighted by the idea of a new place to visit Grandma. Only Roz and I understood what those 7 words actually were. They were a confession. My daughter had just announced, in front of witnesses, at my own birthday table, that she believed she had the legal standing to decide where I would live, and she believed it because she believed she owned half of my house. I smiled. I want you to know exactly how I smiled, because it is the single most useful skill 35 years of closings ever gave me. I smiled the way I used to smile across a table at a seller who thought I hadn't noticed the unrecorded easement, the smile that says nothing yet and promises everything later. I said, "That's a lovely thought, sweetheart. Let's talk about it soon." And I cut the cake. If you've ever sat at a table and smiled through something that would have knocked the breath out of you a year earlier, you understand exactly what that cake tasted like. Stay with me, because we are 3 weeks away from the evening my daughter finally learned what her mother actually does for a living. I spent those 3 weeks finishing the file, and I want to walk you through it the way I would have walked a client through a closing binder, because the order matters. Nathaniel Pierce and I built it in 5 sections, tabbed, the way I'd organized every complex title file of my career. Tab 1 held the original defective deed itself, the certified copy from the registry, Book 4471, page 209, alongside the Secretary of State printout showing Wendell Pruitt's notary commission had lapsed 11 months before he stamped it. Tab 2 held Roz's formal written analysis as a deputy registrar, stating plainly that the instrument should never have been accepted for recording and outlining the statutory grounds for setting it aside. Tab 3 held Nathaniel's completed petition to the Granger County Superior Court to quiet title and restore sole ownership to me, ready to file the moment I gave the word. Tab 4 held what I'd come to think of as the pattern of conduct section, the forwarded email confirming Vanessa's tour of Sunrise Meadows Assisted Living, dated 6 weeks before my birthday, along with 3 separate call logs from her cell phone provider, subpoenaed later through Nathaniel but which I already had informal knowledge of through Todd, showing calls to 2 other senior facilities in the preceding 4 months. And Tab 5, the one I was proudest of and saddest about in equal measure, held the assignment of note and mortgage from Granger Community Bank to Birch Hollow Holdings LLC, my LLC, dated 3 weeks before my birthday, showing that I now legally held the paper on my own daughter's house. I called the family meeting for the second Sunday in September, a month after the birthday, at my house, at that same long table. I told Vanessa I wanted to talk seriously, the way she'd asked, about the future. I told Todd I wanted him there too, because I wanted a family conversation, not a private one. I asked Roz to come, and I asked Nathaniel Pierce to come, and I did not explain to any of them, except Roz, exactly what was about to happen, because I have learned that a room full of people bracing for something rarely behaves as honestly as a room full of people who believe they've arrived for pot roast. They arrived at 4 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon that had turned gray and cool, the first real edge of fall in the air. Derek came in easy, confident, the way a man walks into a room when he believes he already knows how the conversation is going to end. Vanessa hugged me at the door and told me she was glad I was finally being open to this. Todd looked mildly confused about why there was a lawyer at the table. Nathaniel had his folder. Roz sat where Roz always sat, at my right hand, which had once been Walter's seat, and which she now filled, at family gatherings, with a quiet loyalty that never once asked for credit. I let everyone sit. I did not serve dinner first this time. Some conversations should not be softened by a good meal, and I had decided, 3 weeks earlier, that this was one of them. I want to talk today about the house, I said, and about a document that's been sitting in the public record for 3 years that most of the people at this table don't know exists. I opened tab 1. 3 years ago, 4 months after your father died, I signed a document at this table. I was told it was a power of attorney for banking convenience. It was not. I placed the certified deed on the table, face up, and slid it toward Vanessa. This is a quitclaim deed, recorded in the Granger County Registry of Deeds, granting you a joint tenancy interest in this house, effective the day it was recorded, not the day I might die. Derek's cousin Wendell notarized it. I watched Derek's face change first, The way a man's face changes when he realizes the ground under a plan has shifted before he expected it to. Vanessa's took a moment longer, the confusion of someone still hoping there was an innocent explanation coming. "There's a problem with the notarization," I said, and I laid the Secretary of State printout beside the deed. Wendell's commission had lapsed 11 months before he signed this. A notary who is not currently commissioned cannot lawfully notarize a signature. Which means, according to my attorney, my former colleague at the county registry, and 35 years of my own professional judgment, this deed is defective on its face and subject to being set aside by the court. I have already filed the petition to do exactly that. "Mom," Derek started, "that was just paperwork. Wendell's done 100 of these." "I'm not finished," I said, and I said it in the exact tone I used to use across closing tables when a seller tried to talk over a title problem instead of solving it. Steady. Not loud. The tone that has ended more arguments than shouting ever did in my experience. I let it sit for 3 full seconds, the way silence works better than any accusation, and then I opened tab 4. "While you were telling your brother and anyone else who'd listen that I seemed a little foggy lately, a little forgetful," I said, looking at Vanessa now, not Derek, "you were touring Sunrise Meadows Assisted Living. 6 weeks before my birthday. I have the confirmation email. You called 2 other facilities in the months before that. I have the records." Vanessa's face had gone the particular shade of pale I remembered from clients who realized, mid-closing, that the thing they'd hoped nobody would notice had, in fact, been noticed. "That's not concern for a mother, Vanessa. That's building a case." I would know. I built cases for a living for 35 years, and I recognize one when my own daughter constructs it around me. Todd was very quiet, looking between his sister and the papers on the table, and I watched something settle into his face that I can only describe as the specific grief of realizing you've been kept out of a story that was happening right in front of you. "We were worried about you, Mom," Vanessa said, and her voice had climbed into the register people use when they're arguing a position they've already, privately, stopped believing. "This house is too much. It's not safe for you alone out here." "I've lived alone out here for 4 years and I have never once fallen, forgotten a bill, or missed a doctor's appointment," I said. "What's actually not safe out here, Vanessa, is a construction business 3 payments behind on its equipment financing, with a bank sending certified letters, looking at a mother-in-law's mortgage-free house as the easiest asset in the family to liquidate." Derek's jaw tightened in a way that told me, more clearly than any document could have, that I'd hit the actual center of it. "That's not," he started, and then stopped, because there wasn't really an end to that sentence that helped him. "I want to be very clear with everyone at this table about something," I said, and I opened the final folder, tab 5, and set it in the middle of the table where everyone could see it. 3 weeks ago, before my birthday, before Vanessa stood up and told me this was my last one in this house, I purchased something. I let that land the way I'd let a number land at the end of a long presentation, because timing, in this business, is everything. I now hold the mortgage note on your home on Larkspur Court, Derek. All of it. Through a company I formed. Granger Community Bank sold off a package of distressed construction loans this summer to clean up their books before an examination. Your note was in it. I bought it. The room went the particular kind of silent that doesn't have a name, the silence after a number changes everyone's understanding of who's actually sitting at the table. Derek stared at the assignment document the way I imagine a man stares at a diagnosis he wasn't expecting. Vanessa read her own address on the page and I watched her physically recoil, just slightly, the way a body does before the mind has finished catching up. "You own our house," Derek said, very quietly, and it wasn't a question. "I own the note on your house," I said. "There's a difference," And it's an important one, and given what your family has just spent 3 years trying to do to me, I think it's a difference worth you understanding fully. I am not calling that note. I have no intention of foreclosing on my own grandchildren's home. I let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. I want to be clear about that because I am not you. I did not learn deception from either of you. I learned it exists, and I learned to defend against it, which is a different skill entirely. But I want you to understand something, both of you, sitting at this table, in front of your brother, in front of my attorney, in front of my oldest friend. You spent 3 years believing you had leverage over me because of a piece of paper you got signed while I was grieving and not paying close enough attention. You had no idea what I actually own. You had no idea what I've spent 35 years learning to protect, or what I'm capable of finding when I finally decide to look. Vanessa was crying now, the real kind, not performance, and I want to be fair and tell you I believe it was real. Because I have watched enough real and false tears across enough tables in my career to know the difference, and this was real. Mom, I didn't want it to be like this. Derek said it would be simple. He said everybody does this kind of estate planning now, he said it would just protect you. It would have protected you, I said, gently now, because there is a place in every hard conversation for gentleness once the facts are fully on the table. And I have never believed in cruelty for its own sake. It would have protected your family's finances, using an asset that belonged to me, obtained through a document neither of you were honest with me about, at a moment when I was least equipped to catch it. I understand you're frightened, Vanessa. I understand Derek's business is drowning and I understand what that fear does to people. Because your father and I built everything we had from nothing and I remember exactly what that fear feels like at 3 a.m. But fear does not entitle you to my home. And using your own children's inheritance, and my grandchildren's stability, as collateral for a scheme built on a defective deed and a lapsed notary commission, that was a choice, not a circumstance. I looked at Derek directly. And Wendell's lapsed commission is going to be reported to the Secretary of State's licensing board, because a man who notarizes fraudulent transfers for a living needs to answer for that regardless of what happens between our families. Nathaniel spoke for the first time, calm, precise, the voice of a man who has delivered exactly this kind of news across exactly this kind of table more times than either Vanessa or Derek had probably imagined possible. The petition to quiet title has already been filed with the Superior Court. Given the defective notarization, we expect the joint tenancy to be set aside and sole ownership restored to Mrs. Whitfield within 60 to 90 days. That part isn't a negotiation. It's already moving through the court. Here's what happens now, I said, and I want you to understand I had rehearsed this part the way I once rehearsed the terms of a difficult closing. Because the terms matter as much as the discovery. 1. The deed is corrected. This house is mine, solely, the way it was always supposed to be. 2. I am not calling the note on Larkspur Court, and I have no intention of foreclosing, provided, and I looked at Derek very directly here, provided Cole Builders gets current on its equipment financing and stops treating my family as a line of credit. I will work with you on reasonable terms through Marjorie Ostrander's firm, the way any legitimate note holder would, because I am not interested in destroying you, Derek, I'm interested in never being deceived by you again. 3. I want an honest conversation with both of you, separately from all of this paperwork, about why you thought this was the only way to solve your problems, because I think the answer to that question matters more than any deed. And 4. I am 70 years old and I am not moving to Sunrise Meadows or anywhere else, not this year, not next year, not until I decide it's time, and that decision will be mine and mine alone, made with my own faculties, which are, I assure everyone at this table, entirely intact. Nobody argued with the terms. Vanessa put her face in her hands. Derek stared at the assignment document like he could will it into meaning something different than it did, turning it over once as though the back of the page might say something kinder than the front. Roz sat perfectly still beside me the entire time, exactly the witness I'd asked her to be, taking it all in without a single word, though I noticed her hand find mine under the table once, briefly, the way an old friend does when she knows a moment is costing you more than you're letting the room see. Nathaniel closed his folder quietly, the small, practiced motion of a man who has delivered hard news across a table more times than he could count and knows better than to fill a silence that doesn't belong to him. Todd, quiet through nearly the whole thing, finally spoke, and what he said surprised me more than almost anything else that evening. "Why didn't you tell me any of this was happening, Mom?" "I could have helped. Because I needed you to hear it the same way the court will hear it," I told him, honestly, evidence first, conclusion second. "And because some things a person has to be shown, not told, or they don't fully believe them. I want to tell you what happened in the months after that Sunday, because I think the aftermath matters as much as the confrontation, maybe more, and because this isn't a story about revenge, whatever it might have sounded like for the last 10 minutes. The court set aside the fraudulent deed in November, a little over 2 months later, exactly as Nathaniel predicted. Sole title to the house on Birch Hollow Road was restored to Eleanor Whitfield, clean, uncontested. The record corrected the way I correct every bad title I ever find, completely and permanently. Wendell Pruitt's file went to the Secretary of State's licensing board, along with Roz's formal statement. He lost whatever remained of his notary privileges and, I'm told, a fair amount of side work that depended on them, which I am not sorry about, because a man who stamps fraudulent transfers involving elderly widows does not get my sympathy simply because he's somebody's cousin. The board's inquiry, I later learned, turned up 2 other complaints against him from families in neighboring towns, both involving documents signed under circumstances his clients later called confusing or rushed. I don't know the details of those cases, and I didn't ask, but I take a small, grim comfort in knowing my own carefulness ended up protecting people I'll never meet. Derek and I worked out payment terms on the Larkspur court note through Marjorie's firm, structured, formal, at market rate, exactly the way I would have structured it for any stranger, because that was the point. Cole Builders got current within 4 months, sold off 2 of the stalled spec homes at a loss but enough to stabilize the business, and Derek, to his credit, never missed a single payment to Birch Hollow Holdings after that Sunday. I don't know if that came from shame or from finally understanding what it costs to be dishonest with someone who reads paper for a living. Either way, I'll take it. Vanessa and I are still finding our way back to each other, slowly, the way you rebuild a chain of title after a defect, carefully, document by document, trust earned back one honest conversation at a time rather than assumed the way it used to be. She came to see me alone in October, sat at that same pine table, and told me the truth I think she'd needed to say out loud for a long while. That she'd been terrified, watching Derek's business collapse, terrified of losing the house on Larkspur Court, terrified of what it would mean for Mason and Lily, and that somewhere in that terror she had let herself believe that taking from me quietly was somehow different, somehow gentler, than taking from a stranger, because I was her mother and mothers are supposed to absorb things. I told her what I'll tell you now, watching this. Being someone's mother was never a license to be deceived by them. I raised her to be honest, and I forgave her, eventually, the way you forgive family, not because the harm didn't matter, but because the relationship still does. But I did not, and will not, hand back the leverage that protected me. Some doors, once you understand why they needed a lock, stay locked. She asked me once, that October afternoon, whether I could ever really trust her again the way I used to, without watching for it. I told her the truth, because I'd promised myself after the birthday that I was done softening things for anyone's comfort, including my own. I said, probably not the way I did before, Vanessa, but that's not entirely a loss. I trusted you blindly for 44 years and it very nearly cost me my home. What we build back now will be smaller, maybe, but it will be honest, and honest has held up a great deal better for me than blind ever did." She cried again at that, and this time I let myself reach across the table and take her hand, the same hand I'd held through the drive to kindergarten and a broken engagement in her 20s and her own wedding day, because forgiveness and vigilance, I've learned, are not actually opposites. You can hold both at once. I do, every day now. Todd flies in more now than he used to, and I suspect that's its own small, quiet gift this whole ordeal gave me, an oldest son who finally understood there was more happening in his mother's life than Sunday phone calls had ever told him. He calls every Sunday now instead of every other, and last month he asked me, half joking, half not, whether I'd teach him how to pull a property record online so he could check his own house in Ohio, and I spent 40 minutes on the phone walking him through it step by step the way I once walked strangers through their closings, and it was, without question, one of the best conversations I've had with my son in a decade. Roz still comes to every birthday. This year, my 71st, we had it again at the pine table Walter built, roast and lemon cake, and nobody stood up to tell me it was my last one anywhere. Vanessa brought Mason and Lily, 7 and delighted by small ceremonies the way 7-year-olds are, asked if she could carve her initials in the porch railing next to her mother's, the way Vanessa had done at 9. I said yes. Some things are still allowed to be simple. I started, this past spring, volunteering one afternoon a week at the County Senior Center, teaching a small class I call Reading Your Own Paper, how to pull your own deed, how to check a notary's commission, how to recognize a power of attorney that's asking for more than it should, how to protect the one asset most of us spend our whole working lives paying for. 12 women showed up the first week, folding chairs in a church basement, coffee in styrofoam cups. 4 of them, it turned out, had signed something in the last 5 years they didn't fully understand either. One had co-signed a home equity line for a nephew without realizing it made her personally liable for the full balance. Another had a grandson holding her power of attorney who'd never once shown her a bank statement in 3 years. I walked each of them, one at a time after class, through the same steps I once walked myself: pull your deed, check the notary's commission status on the Secretary of State's site, read every page before you sign, and if anyone tells you it's just a formality, that is precisely the moment to slow down. Roz comes some Tuesdays and sits in the back, and between the two of us we'd probably prevented more quiet theft this year than either of us managed in our last 5 years of paid work combined. I spent 35 years protecting strangers from bad paper. It turns out the most important closing of my career was my own, and I very nearly missed it. Derek finished paying off the remaining balance on the Larkspur Court note ahead of the original schedule this past June, a full 18 months early, and when he made that final payment he drove out to Birch Hollow Road himself, alone, and handed me the paperwork in person instead of mailing it. He didn't say much. He shook my hand the way Walter always said he did, firm, honest. I think that was Derek's way of closing his own file, and I let him have it without making him say more than he was ready to. Cole Builders is smaller now, 2 employees instead of 6, but it's current on every obligation it carries, and Derek tells me he sleeps better than he has in 3 years, which I believe, because fear does terrible things to a person's judgment, and I understand that better than almost anyone. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 71 years old now. I spent 35 years finding the lie hidden inside paper that looked perfectly clean, and in the end, the most important title I ever cleared was the one on my own front door. If someone in your life has ever told you what's best for you while quietly deciding what's best for them, check the paper. Read what you sign. Pull your own record once a year, the way I always did, even when nobody's told you to worry. Because the people who love you the most are not always the people who tell you the truth, And the people who underestimate you are usually the ones who forget you were paying attention the whole time. Thank you for staying with me tonight. If this story reminded you to check something in your own name, or to call your mother and ask her what she actually owns, do it today. If you've ever been the one everyone assumed was slowing down, drop a comment and tell me what you found when you finally looked. Subscribe to GM Mom Stories for more, and remember, the paper doesn't lie. It just waits for someone patient enough to read it.